And we have Professor Manan Suri of IIT Delhi. And we have Professor Deepak of IIT Kanpur. I will be the moderator. We'll have. Hello. Hello. Check. Okay, my first question is for Professor Urbi and Professor Manansuri. Ma'am, can you please tell us what is a puff and what are different types of puffs?
Okay, so PUF is a short form of physically unclonable function. It's a Boolean function, but the difference is that it's not a mathematical function, it's a hardware function. So what happens is that when we manufacture a device, there are certain property in a particular device which is unclonable, and it depends at the time of it incurs into the device when we manufacture it. Okay, so the main fundamental concept of physically unclonable function is to leverage this hardware intrinsic property and utilize it to generate a hardware fingerprint of that particular device. Now, PUF can be of many types, digital PUF, analog PUF. We have something called optical PUF, coating PUF. It depends on what kind of hardware property that you are exploiting to generate this function.
Professor Manansuri, can you please tell us what digital puff and what is an analog puff? What are the differences between both of them?
Sure. So just to add to what Professor Woodby mentioned, PUF, basically you can think of it as a fingerprint or as a unclonable identity of any system that you're trying to create. You know, like how you have the thumb impression, or you may have the iris or the retina. So a unique signature, that is what PUF is. And PUFs can be of various forms, as Professor Woodby also mentioned. So digital and analog PUFs would come, the differentiation would be based on how they are generated, how they are extracted. If they are extracted in with certain thresholds in a certain way, using concepts of Boolean algebra, then it would be a digital puff. If they are extracted from more natural properties of materials or systems, then it will be an more likely to be an analog puff. So,
Are there any applications that needs analog puffs as opposed to digital puffs, or can any puff be used for anything?
yeah, so puffs in general, they can have many applications, many different applications, and as we speak, more new use cases are being thought of in the security domain. So, as you know, fingerprint or the biometric identity, the first most basic use case is the identification,
Right.
or the authentication, unique authentication or association of a unique identity to the individual or to the component. So that is the most basic use case of puff. Then further, depending on the quality of how the puff signature is, how its statistical quality, you can use it for more higher level security applications. You can use it as a seed. You can use it as a source of entropy. So then it can lead to RNG or PRNG, TRNG, or encryption, decryption kind of different use cases. So it can be used at various places in the entire security chain. So.
Okay. Okay. So my next question is for Professor Deepak. Sir, by the looks of it, puff needs some sort of silicon component in them, right? So is it true? What are your thoughts on this?
Actually, just to continue to expand and answer your question with it, so puff fingerprint name has been used. Let me put it other way around. When you try to make something, you design and target that.
Right.
Puff is exact opposite of that. Whatever you design, you can't have it. Nature gives it to you. Anything we make is not a puff. Anything nature makes is a puff. Now, once you have that definition, then that tells you it need not be silicon. So the way I look at it is, you have to look back how you will identify it. You may have a fingerprint. The question will be, how would you use fingerprint to identify? That device, that algorithm tells you what kind of puff to use, because nature-wise, fingerprint, iris, our face, everything is puff. Gentleman sitting there writing someone's pen, look at that paper, it has orientation of fibers in it.
Right.
That's a puff. So throw marble somewhere in the room, it's a puff. It randomly locate itself. So really puffs are of any kind. Which one you want to use is determined by what you have in your hand to identify it.
Right. So can you give us some practical examples on where puffs can be used today?
So as I started work, I've been working on this for last 7-8 years, and essentially I work on where the outcome is not electronic, device is not electronic, hardware such as this bottle, a piece of medicine, or fertilizer, or a pesticide, or your Colgate toothpaste, or whatever it is. How do you know that what you're buying from Unilever, that Colgate you're buying, or somewhere in between? So you could use for anything and everything.
Right.
You can start for document security, physical documents, for tickets, IPL tickets get cloned and people enter with those.
Right.
And you can see the France, same thing happened, football match about 3-4 months ago. Anything you can secure with those. The applications are just good. Yeah.
Okay. So my next question is for all of you. So how does a puff ensure uniqueness, right? So where is the source of randomness that comes in a puff?
You can start.
Yeah, so actually, as sir mentioned, that he gave several examples that you throw piece of marbles and how they move, or fibers in a paper and so on. So, so any pattern, when it is ensured either through its internal phenomena or by some external mechanisms, that pattern, when it occurs, is very unique. And it cannot be easily replicated, or it cannot be replicated by design. That is when it becomes puff.
Right.
So now which mechanism is ensuring it will be different. I'll give you an example. Like, we have been extensively working on electronic puffs, semiconductor puffs. Very basic example, you take any capacitor and you apply a voltage across the capacitor and you try to blow it up, or you try to break it down. If you keep exceeding the voltage that you apply across a capacitor, it will ultimately give into it will break down. Now, the pattern in which the dielectric breaks down, that is beyond the control of any individual. Few nanometers, few angstroms variation, the morphology of the nanomaterials or the oxide layers, that changes. You look at lightning, you cannot determine when lightning happens what will be the pattern of the lightning strike. So different phenomena which are either by the physics, underlying physics, or the virtue of their mechanism ensures that it is non-clonable,
Right.
and it is unique.
Right. So my next question is for Professor Urbi. Professor Manansuri was talking about, let's say, and then on a nanometer scale, like we can identify, but when it comes to the practice, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to identify on a nanometer, or let's say on a nanosecond, right? So how does puff identify? How does any puff, let's say digital analog, how does, for example, puff identify the delay? Let's say a delay based puff that has, let's say, 1 nanometer, 1 nanosecond difference between input and output. How do you use that to generate something like a true random number?
Okay, we definitely cannot realize it in the nanoscale level,
Right.
but we can try to make a digital design to amplify that delay.
Right.
So the delay-based puff actually is not just taking the difference between two single delays. So what we do, we make a 64 stage or 128 stage delay based puff, where the delay difference across these 64 or 128 stages gets added and amplified, and after that we keep a D flip-flop or a kind of arbiter which takes that what is the delay difference between these two symmetrically laid chain, and the response is generated.
Sure. So are there any metrics to measure different parameters of a puff?
Yes, we do have. So to check that whether a puff is of good quality or not, first of all, we have to understand that what kind of puff we are making, whether it is a strong puff or is it a weak puff. So if it is a weak puff, the purpose of it is just to generate a secret key. So there we can go with the uniqueness and intra-hamming distance across the devices, right? But when it comes to strong puff, the purpose is to do unlimited authentication. So then we have to understand that whether it is unique. Uniqueness is a must. Then how much uniform it is. So the balance between 0 response and 1 response should be 50%. Then comes the reliability. That is, the puffs should be random, but it should be repetitively random, right? So it should be close to 100% reliable. Then the fourth thing is, which we actually have to take care of, it should be tamper-proof. Right? And the fifth one, when it comes to strong puff, we also need to check that specifically for delay-based puff or oscillation frequency-based puff, it should not be mathematically modeled by any machine learning tool. Okay, so sometimes it happens that the puff is physically not clonable, but we can make a mathematical model of it. So these are the 4 or 5 properties that should be tested while we design a puff chip.
Do you know of any certifications that puff product has to go through to ensure this is met?
No, not yet, but there are few tools. One of the tools named Puff Meter, which has been proposed by WPI Institute of, it's an institute in USA, to evaluate this kind of evaluation strategy for Puff.
Professor Deepak, can you tell us a bit more about your sticker? It's quite interesting to know about how you are using a non-electronic based puff to solve a very real problem of FMCG goods.
Right. Okay. So basically what we have done is we were inspired by farmland. Farmland, when it dries, it cracks. That crack which forms is same thing as like a fingerprint at our birth, which we acquire at time of birth. So at the birth, that crack pattern is formed and nobody informed it. It's the physics and the random nature of it which formed it. So we have invented an ink that as soon as you paint it, it cracks. And therefore it leaves some of the spaces. The spaces it leaves, that ink climbs up on the other portions where it moves and it becomes 3D slightly. Now the point I was trying to make in this is that clonability. So fundamental question, and this I'll connect to this back to fundamental question is litmus test is first ask the guy who made it one time, can he make it again? If he can make it again, it's not puff. Then question is, that is by same method. Then the second question is, can you use some other process to mimic the same? The answer is then strong and weak puff as to how much you have, I need not mimic the entire puff. I need to mimic only a small portion of it, and which gives the same challenge response pair. So what you have to, therefore, for our case, what we had to do was that design it according to the algorithm we'll use, and we wanted to use a mobile phone for verifying, which all consumers have when they want to verify. Right. So it has to be tailored accordingly, the size and all that stuff.
Okay. Professor Urbi, can we have any protocols that are built on top of puffs? Can you please throw some light on that?
Yeah, so puff is nothing but just a primitive, right? Similar to AISS, ECC, RSA, or whatever security primitive we've developed. Now, there is a very famous attack that has come up in CCS. CCS is a very high venue, top venue for computer security, where all of us, we use WPA2 when we connect our phone to the Wi-Fi router, right? So an attacker can launch a man-in-the-middle attack, and without even touching the AES protocol or AES algorithm that is running while we are connecting our phone to a Wi-Fi router, they can get your secret key. Okay, what is the cause? The problem is that somebody makes theoretically the cryptographic algorithm. Then there are some other people who make the development, and then we run it into a networking application. Right. So there is a mismanagement in the understanding of the security assumptions. Okay, so that is where protocol comes into the picture. That what kind of technology we are implementing, where we are implementing it, what is the application where we are going to implement and who are going to use it.
Right.
So protocol is the amalgamation of all these factors, not
Right.
only the primitive.
Right.
And yes, like other hardware security or any cryptographic primitive, PUF also need authentication mechanism or authentication protocol to run on top of the primitive.
Right. Can you please throw some light on how PUFs can be used in authentication?
Yeah. So puffs are nothing but a challenge response mechanism.
Right.
So first we fabricate the puff chip, and then during the manufacturing process only, when the puff is fabricated, we give some challenge to it and get the response. And the assumption, security assumptions, is that these challenge response pairs must be securely safe in a database. Nobody should hack it.
Sure.
Okay. Now you deploy this puff chip into the insecure network, right? Now, as a verifier, the verifier will have access to this challenge response pair database. They will send the challenge.
Okay.
Puff will be characterized. The response will come to the verifier, and it will match with the stored response. If they are same or in a threshold, then we will say that the puff is authenticated. This is a very naive. There are more development on top of it, but this is the naive way of doing authentication protocol for puff.
Okay. So, Professor Manansuri, nowadays we see a lot of fault injection attacks. Can you please tell us what a fault injection is?
Yeah, so basically fault injection attack is if you have any electronic system and by doing some external stimuli which can be invasive or non-invasive, you're trying to either disrupt the process, or you're trying to disrupt the desired action, or you're trying to gain some information in an unauthorized way. So fault injection attacks can be purely electronic, where some current or voltage stimuli is injected by an adversary. These can be electromagnetic, these can be based on acoustics, these can be based on optics, just by shining a laser or some other light. So that is what fault injection attack is.
Sure. So, can you please tell us how puffs are protected against fault injection, something like a fault injection attack?
How puffs are protected, or how puffs would protect against
protect against fault injection attacks.
So fault injection attacks at a system level, how fault injection attacks would succeed is by doing certain stimuli and then observing the disrupted response of the system that is being attacked. So when that is done over several time, some pattern may emerge, giving you some vital details about the system that is being challenged.
Right.
So puff, by the uniqueness of it, will go against this, against yielding a decipherable pattern. So that is how perhaps puffs might be useful against fault injection attacks.
Sure. So, are you saying, let's say, for example, when a fault is injected, that will probably change the physical characteristics, which will have a lot of variance in output, which is very different to what was the output when it was manufactured. So that's how puffs protect against the fault injection, or?
Yeah, see, the microelectronic puffs or nanoelectronic puffs, when basically it's exploitation of physics,
Right,
and when we are trying to exploit it, as Professor Ulvi also mentioned, we have to amplify those signals.
Right.
So that means we are working at a domain which is already very, very subtle, very small.
Sure.
So if you are working with very minute variations, it's also easy to disturb it. So when you do an external fault injection attack, it's very easy to disturb the setup. And thus, if you have disturbed the setup, if you have changed the configuration of the setup, you may not end up with the same output again.
Sure. Okay. Can Professor Deepak, can you tell us how IoT devices can benefit from having a puff? So this can be, let's say, pre-onboarding or post-onboarding. How can puffs be utilized in the context of IoT?
Yeah, so I will defer part of the question to these guys who know a lot more from the electronic side. So I will come from, there are two levels at which you have to protect IoT device or any device. For example, when you go to buy something, as person going there does not have access inside.
Right.
You can't probe it. So at first stage itself, it's a relationship between you and a brand. When you go and buy a particular brand, then you want assurance that it is from them. Rest you accept that whatever is. So one way, the way I think is for enabling consumers to have stickers like we have made, the puff which I described, and then consumer using a mobile phone can verify before they buy. Then the next level would be getting into the device and probing it. That I would not know much, and I'll pass on.
Sure.
Let them address one of you guys.
Just to add to the IoT device point, so let's say you have a network of connected IoT devices where you would want only authenticated IoT devices to
Right.
be communicating with. So in the typical way, without using PUFs, you would first assign some ID to them.
Right.
That ID would be stored. If you have a network of surveillance or CCTV cameras and you don't want a spoofed camera to be inside your network, you would assign some IDs to them. You would maintain the data bank, reverse data bank of those IDs, and then authenticate that whether it's a verified device or not. Now, if you have a PUF chip sitting on the SoC or PUF IP sitting on the SoC or the PCB of the IoT device, it will inherently give its signature. And so you are in the first place, you are not storing, you are not programming that ID. So you are into the IoT device just by the virtue of its fabrication, you are getting that signature. So this is more safe. You are eliminating one layer of exposure of your ID while programming in the firmware or programming in the device. It's naturally coming over there because it is a hardware PUF. So that is one way where it can help IoT devices.
Professor Urbi, do we have anything to add?
Yeah, I will give you a small real example.
Sure.
I will not take any company's name, but there is a very famous fabricating company. They have upgraded their policy to make smart light.
Okay.
It was around 2016. And then in 2017 S&P conference, a paper came out where the researchers has found out that all the lights, smart lights that that particular company produced, for the whole batch, they have a single secret key. So if you break one light, you can hack all the lights. And what they have done, a particular company installed that kind of a light in their all 4-storied building, and just using a drone, they have actually hacked their light and shut down the whole light system. Okay, so when we talk about IoT, it is the business of millions of devices, and to give them unique, finite key is a very hard task. So that is where PUF can come up as a rescue and give us unique ID, which can at a protocol level be used to create your public-private key pair or a secret key. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Please. Yes, sure.
So this is an example I'm working on right now. So simple objects like your coffee maker in office. Actually, it is an IoT device. They put a SIM card in there. They control it from wherever the factory is, maintenance, etc. The problem is the coffee maker. People pour coffee, which is cheap coffee. So we are trying to put our tag on the coffee, which is to be put in. Once that tag is scanned, it will automatically send a signal to the machine to open and brew coffee. Otherwise, it won't.
Wow. Okay.
So it's a device which can lock from physical PUFs also.
Okay. Okay. Now we'll open the floor for audience questions. Yeah.
So I think it's a good conversation, right? I'm just curious, how do you address the threat vector of deny scenarios? Say, for example, when you have a PUF in your IoT device, there could be other things which can influence your PUF, such that the identity can be it's over. The integrity of that whole identity is not questionable because you have other factors influencing your PUF, like a deny scenario.
So you are trying to say, how can I make my PUF secure, right?
Yeah. So what about the threat vector of other factors impacting your PUF?
Yeah. So if we talk about ambient factor variation.
Say, for example, the throwing marbles, right?
Mm-hmm.
Same person might throw in one particular format. Maybe there's a chance of collision is high.
Yeah.
But when you throw the marble from 10 different people, the collision goes down. But the impacting factor here is the person who is throwing the marble. So in your case, how do you actually eliminate the risk of external factors impacting your PUF?
Yes. So for that, what we do, we have a concept called virtual proof. Okay. So with that kind of a concept, what we do, suppose we are we have a puff chip, okay, which has been added with your IoT device, okay. So what we do, we characterize, before even implementing the puff chip in the IoT device, we test the puff across voltage fluctuation, humidity changes, temperature variation and all. So if the puff is a good candidate, its response should be unique across all the ambient factor variations, but because it is a hardware chip, it will be prone to the ambient factor variations. So that's what we do. We try to model the puff across this ambient factors, and the stored the CRP database across all possible factors, okay, ambient factors. That's the challenge response pairs, which we just talked about for the authentication. Now, these IoT devices generally have these temperature sensors and all. So with respect to that particular temperature, we can verify the characteristics of the puff at that particular temperature. Okay. With respect to environmental changes, there are countermeasures to keep your puff safe. With respect to fault attack, puff is used to protect against fault attack. There can be fault attack in puff also. So there is a countermeasure named fault detection logic, which can protect the puff against any kind of side channel or fault attacks also. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add to what Mr. Rudby mentioned is, so there are many puff concepts, but the ones that would qualify are very few. So because there is very rigorous statistical testing, millions of trials and repetitions need to be done in simulated conditions, controlled conditions, before the influencing factors can be checked.
Biomedical device, right? One wrong is good enough to give a wrong signal to the body.
So statistically, very few puffs actually survive that get to be called as a deployed puff. And the other thing is that current state of the art is doing ML-based attacks on puffs, deep learning-based attacks on puff, and that gives you also a wider exploration space to anticipate what kind of different attacks can happen by an attacker. So, but if in the system there is some other weak link, in spite of having the puff, then again, that would start impacting it. But it will not, like if your communication channel itself is weak, so that might lead to some other compromise.
So basically, puff cannot solve all the security problems. So for that, we have to have full stack security analysis at different level of the application.
So, hi. How do we basically differentiate between true random number generator and the puffs? Because in authentication, we'll be using, to generate the private key or something, we'll be using true random number generator. So, the same application is puff, as you told that in authentication, we can generate a individual secret key for each time when we like if it is an IoT device. So how do we generate?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In simple terms, puff's job might end with a one-time job. A TRNG or a PRNG has to keep doing its job for a long time. It has to provide you a source, a completely new random sequence whenever you want it to generate. A puff just needs to give you one finite signature. That is the simplest difference between the two. Then again, there is a whole statistical suite of tests that have to conform to. So puff, basically you need something to authenticate you, to identify you. TRNG or PRNG means you need a source of random number whenever you need a random number. Okay, so that need not correspond to someone's identity. That might correspond to some entropy, some seed, some source, but an identity needs to come for one time first. So.
How to generate the challenge response pair database? Like we have to check for the all such.
Like this, like suppose we have a 128-bit puff in our hardware or any device. So we have to generate the database for all 2 to the power 128 challenges. Like,
so see that again, I'll answer this question in a localized way, just with respect to the puffs that we work with. We work on electronic puffs, and in electronic puffs, your tools to play with are voltages and currents, right? So depending on how many unique signatures you need, what is the size of your chip, what are the number of inputs and outputs, you constrain, reduce the number of cases. So what you said, you don't go to that high number of theoretical cases. If I just need 5 unique signatures from one PUF chip, then as soon as I get those 5, after statistical evaluation, I'll stop at that point.
Okay. Can we combine the traditional cryptographic algorithm with PUF to enhance the security, or it is an alternative to traditional cryptographic?
Absolutely. So it's at many places it's complementary to the crypto stack. So even for crypto, you would need some source, you would need some seed, right? So sometimes PUF can act as that seed. Even for hash, for some sort of hash applications or some additional mathematical obfuscation operations that you want to do, you can use PUF to as a seed or a complementary seed to do that.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
So I'm thinking of a enterprise applicability of this whole thing. I recall Professor Suri talk about when the chips are created, or when the say for example the motherboards are created, you create a puff out of how the hardware. I don't know what you call the things inside the hardware. The signature, or what is the right term. Now that essentially means that the OEMs, the original equipment providers, would have to maintain a database for all the puffs to say, for example, do authentication or anything to basically kind of ensure that this hardware is basically from my organization. Correct? Anything centralization means a single point of failure. So technically, the more puffs, the more you create. Essentially, you basically put all the puffs in that central database, which becomes a central point of failure. That is number one. What are your thoughts on it? So that's my question. The second thought is security of that database also falls under your current research? If not, that's fine, no problem.
So, see, in PUF, you have to understand that it's not just an exchange, direct exchange of a sequence. It's actually a process. It's a physical process which yields that answer. So, let's say even if the database is compromised, you have it. The say challenge response pair, a question and then a response that you are getting. Right now, a very specific physical process will lead to that question when that to that answer when that physical stimuli is applied to that black box. So that process has to happen in the security authentication of it. If you are sitting over there and you are giving the same response, you have seen my database of responses, you may be able to give that response, but there is no necessity that you would generate that response when I apply that stimuli or that challenge to you, because you cannot replicate the intrinsic physics as easily. You may know the final answer, and you may also know that that answer is in response to which challenge, but that process will not be replicated.
Sir, I would like to comment on this one. Whenever we design any crypto system, we have to consider two things. Number one is what is my root of trust, and number two is what is the adversarial model I am considering. Okay, so if we are talking about AES and we say if the password or the secret key is compromised, then eventually the AES algorithm will be compromised, right? So, yes. So, access. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. So database compromise will also can lead to such kind of attack even if we do password-based authentication. Yeah. So here the root of trust is that my database will be secure. Assumption is yeah. Yes, so that's why when I talked about this challenge response pair mechanism, I said that the verifier which is storing this challenge response pair database must be in a secure environment. Yeah.
May I have one question?
In the interest of time, we are running short of time. You can have the question one-on-one. Thank you everyone for such an engaging discussion. It's a pleasure to have you on, and I'll give you a memento.